Colsey, were the shades necessary to really, really rub it in? This is a needed beanie. It's bleak January Northern Hemisphere, and you are...
Look, given that when we did this last week, I was on like death's door, wasn't I? Things are looking up, Charlie. Things are looking up. Yeah, no, I am not in. I'm not in London. I'm not in England. I'm all the way down in South Africa, very, very far away. So for a couple of weeks, relaxation before the Six Nations, but also probably a few little work things sprinkled in, which I can't talk about just yet. But yeah, mate.
Intriguing.
There's nothing worse than doing this trip, as I have done in previous years, last year as well, and then coming back to England and coming back to kind of like the tail end of winter. That is unpleasant. But yeah, no, it's okay. It's okay here, Charlie, in Hermanus. Yeah, mid-20s, bit of a breeze, but I'll be all right. Don't worry.
Oh, I'm not worried. The beanie's off now. It was largely for show.
I will take the sunnies off as well, because I feel like the sunnies are exaggerating things. But yeah, listen, there's actually loads for us to discuss. So we're doing this on Thursday. England will name their squad on Friday, so I think we'll just touch on that at the end. But we've had basically a deluge of the other Six Nations squads. So I reckon let's start by chatting about them, and then we'll dive into the All Blacks as well, and finish off with England and chat Wales in the middle. Charlie, this France squad with no Gael Fickou, no Damien Penaud, no Gregory Alldritt is it's crackers, but I kind of love it, because I can't think of another coach who would be able to get away with this.
Well, yeah. As you're hinting there, the context is key, right? Fabien Galthié is in charge of this huge player pool, and he's always going to have, I think you're always juggling, aren't you, as a test coach, form versus pedigree. And this just looks like a Band-Aid ripped off, quite kind of drastic, with three really experienced, really kind of revered around the world, I would say, players not being involved. And I saw the point made, I think it was EK Rugby on Twitter, who's absolutely outstanding. Follow him if you don't already, but saying that these guys it's not just Six Nations sort of jostling, talking. These three guys, certainly I would say, certainly Penaud, and then you could make a case for the other two, would get into every other Six Nations starting side. Almost, it would all be very, very close. And that is a serious statement. I guess if you are going to look to regenerate your squad and explore what the ceiling could be, then it makes sense to do it now. There are, I think it's about 17 test matches that most Northern Hemisphere sides have until the warm-ups begin. I think it's around that. And this Six Nations is clearly quite a cool campaign to bring in players that have excelled over last summer and then the autumn. But it's still jarring, because I would say that those three, and again, certainly Penaud, you could argue that the other two were maybe on the wane sort of more explicitly, would be sort of like highlight names. And then with the Six Nations, it's sort of, you're getting people who are not, who are potentially sort of more casual fans asking, which players are you going to look out for? But I think Penaud would be one of the first, you'd say, right? And what's quite amusing is that there was no press conference yesterday from Fabien Galthié. That the news had been rumbling for sort of, I think, 24, 48 hours before it broke, and it was kind of confirmed that those three weren't in. So it wasn't a real shock. The shock was when these news reports had started to emerge. But yeah, when it happens, you almost want an explanation, and to not get one, it's leaving us sort of going, well, trying to piece it together ourselves, and it is still jarring, even though it wasn't a massive surprise.
Just on that point, think how many VTs or how much promotional material has been drawn up already with Penaud in it, how many highlight reels to build up the tournament, and he's not going to be there. I read somewhere, and I've forgotten where I saw it, so forgive me, that someone claimed that it was Penaud's defensive work in the England game last year was part of it. It was part of the reason why Galthié wasn't happy. And maybe, I remember, was it last Six Nations in the Wales opener where Atisogby was brilliant, and we thought, okay, like here's another option. And obviously Bielbiari is one of the best players in the world, certainly in that top 10, maybe even higher than that category. It's mad. But like I said at the start, I just can't think of another coach I can't think. I'm talking strictly about Penaud because, like you said, I can kind of see Alldritt. Alldritt got dropped in November. I can kind of understand that. Fickou has been such a stalwart, and I almost feel bad for Fickou because he's been such a solid foundational piece when France have just been like all over the shop over the last decade. And now that they're in a slightly better place, even though the World Cup didn't go as planned 2 years ago, now he gets kind of jettisoned for Mofana and Deporter, which, you know, that's a shame. The Penaud one is really head scratching, and it leaves, you're going to get this France team for that opener against Ireland on Thursday night, which is going to look very different to a lot of people who aren't as in tune with the top 14 as some are. Like it's going to feel very different. The makeup of that back row, the makeup of that back line. But in a way that excites me because I feel like France have this deep player pool where they are capable of pulling off a shock like this. But yeah, I mean, I think Penaud is such an impressive try scorer. Can you really not have that? Fabien Galthié thinks so.
The Atasori things is absolutely emblematic of the talent that they can just keep coming through. We're seeing predicted kind of lineups for Ireland, and to me, the balance of the pack looks a bit funny with Olivon there at lock. But then you do think that you're going to have Miafu sort of with four other members of the back five that are essentially, you know, lithe, super mobile back rowers. That's certainly going to have a bit going for it. But yeah, no, it's just fascinating, and clearly Galthié has built up enough capital to have an experiment here, and as I say, explore the potential of the side and what that could be with the other kind of form players in it. Does it leave them more vulnerable? Perhaps, but as you said, you're never. Just if you think of some of the games that the French side were playing, so they came to Twickenham and ground out what was eventually a late win in really warm sunshine, wasn't it? But again, these are guys that you're not familiar with unless you're watching top 14 week in, week out, that are getting those results. Went over to New Zealand, and albeit against a New Zealand side that was, you know, unconvincing, they were in those test matches for decent periods. So yeah, you're right. There's gonna be a sort of fresh look to France, and that can't be anything but exciting.
There's no Intermac to be clear as well, but that's injury based. So you're going to get a bit of Jalibert at 10, which is great. It just shows a lesson to the lads on the fringes, because Jalibert and Galthier's relationship hasn't always been the best, but bridges can be rebuilt. So you're going to get a bit Jalibert and a bit of Hugo Sounds, I want to say, or Sounds. And this is what's going to be interesting, Charlie. We're going to make shocking pronunciation mistakes now over the next few weeks, because there's going to be players coming in who we're aware of, but whose names we forget to say out loud. And one name that we should be able to manage, though, is Tom Staniforth, who, this is also why I love Galthié. You've gone from being three kind of experienced leaders and then calling up an Aussie who's qualified on residency, who has been a really solid piece for Cast in recent years. Our good friend Russ Petty posted a really interesting stat of just what an efficient worker Staniforth has been for Cast in the top team when he's sort of played full seasons and when he's been fully fit, and he's ranked near the top or in the top three most years for tackles and carries. So you're adding kind of a real engine room piece there. Yeah, I'm fascinated by France.
The unpredictability of them that had kind of gone, we kind of knew that they were actually reasonably consistent. Maybe that's back. And maybe that's what the sort of the VTs and the pre-game kind of sizzle reels, maybe that's what that can focus on as well, is that we actually can wonder about which France is going to turn up. I hate myself for saying that, but hey, it's a straw to clutch at, maybe.
I mean, people, even if we had stopped saying it, people still say it in pubs up and down the country every year the Six Nations rolls around. So why not get back on the bandwagon? Should we jump to chat about Ireland? So a few kind of interesting names in their squad. Obviously, prop depth is a bit of a worry because there's no Andrew Porter at loose head. There's no Michael Milne. So it's looking as though Jack Boyle will get the start at loose head, potentially for that opener in Paris. Jeremy Loughman's come back in. Sorry,
Paddy McCarthy, who's missing. Mark Milne is in, but that's the 1-2 punch, right?
Yeah.
Paddy McCarthy had been coming through looking like a really solid, really dynamic as well, kind of successor to Porter. Porter has just been so important to every side he's played for. because the scrummaging stuff is always under scrutiny there, and they've had a couple of games, the sort of really high stakes games where that hasn't gone his way. But in phase stuff, attack and defense, he works so hard. He's so mobile. He's so tough. Gets through so much work. Often stays on into the 70th minute. So for him not being there feels like a big piece missing. And it's just funny how quickly narratives from you in the Six Nations, and with France away in the first game on a Thursday with a schedule that is kind of constricted with one fewer rest week. It's a tricky place for Ireland. Throw in also the fact that, I don't know, my take on Leinster have kept winning, and they've ended up as third seeds, right? So they will have to go away. This is in the Champions Cup, sorry. They will have to go away for the semi-final. Are they going to get these two home semi? And you keep watching them every week, and you're going, this is the week where they have a result that stings them in this competition, because they're not firing here, they're not firing here, and they're not firing here. But they have ground it out, and they have come on strong, even away in Bayonne, away in Leicester, at home against La Rochelle. They did eventually come through, even though that in the second half they really struggled to get a foothold in that game. They conceded a 4-try bonus point to a rotated Harlequin side who basically went over there in search of 4 tries and nothing else. They've contributed a lot of players to the Lions, obviously, Ireland. So you could say they're looking weary, and that's understandable. And that's another reason why you would back France. However, you also have a lot of winners. Clearly you have a lot of familiarity still, despite the absences. They are in a really interesting place in this sort of halfway point of the World Cup cycle, and a sort of stick or twist kind of scenario too. So it's everybody is in a really interesting spot. Ireland, it's been sort of suggested on the decline, but nick that game in France and everything kind of changes.
Yeah, massively. And how about if you told Harry Byrne last year when he went off to Bristol on loan that we'd get to this Six Nations and he would be in the mix for a bench spot realistically, or maybe even a start in Paris against France, given how well he did at Bristol and how well things had gone back at Leinster. I know that he started the last couple of big Champions Cup games for them ahead of Sam Prendergast, which is quite a telling sign of confidence in him. Fascinating to see that he's back in there. It's a brutal injury list, so like no Ryan Baird. Mac Hansen's done for the season. I saw with a I think a foot injury, which is just brutal. Yeah, they'll miss Baird. But what I did find quite exciting was because Charlie, I'm doing some work while I'm down here. I was going through the highlights of Munster Cast the other night, and I was watching Edwin the Dogbu, and I was like, he looks pretty handy and could give them. I know he's had a horrible run with injuries, as Munster fans will attest to, but I was watching him, I was like, wow, he offers real kind of physicality and skill, and looks like the kind of bench option that maybe Ireland could do with. And he's one of the 2 uncapped players in the squad, and the other one escapes me as I sit here, but I will quickly check it. It's Nathan Doak of Ulster. I looked at him and I was like, yeah, maybe there's a role for him there. The fact that he is in, and the fact that old kind of reliable Ian Henderson is out, sort of has that feel a bit like the France stuff of a real kind of changing of the guard moments. Yeah, I found that quite interesting.
I love that Harry Byrne story. I was just very vainly kind of going through my own. I did a piece on him last year when he came over as injury cover, because to Bristol, McGuinty went down and Bristol just didn't have 10s. It was pitched to, I think Byrne pitched it to himself as a chance not only to sort of get game time, but actually, he knew that the picture could change so quickly, because at that point, if you'll remember, it was Crowley versus Prendergast, and becoming this sort of quite grim culture war actually. But he knew that that was so fragile, because those 2 guys were so young and actually hadn't enhanced their reputations enough, hadn't built that credit in the bank, to use this phrase that coaches use. They hadn't built that, so that he knew that if he got it in a rhythm at Bristol, which he did a bit, then he could be right back in the test picture. And his brother coming to Gloucester means that he got an opening at Leinster, and there you go. And that's how quickly things can change. Kind of does maybe speak to ongoing uncertainty in that crucial position with Ireland in the wake of Johnny Sexton's retirement, which kind of needs sorting pretty quickly, you'd have thought. But yeah, that's certainly the two teams we've spoken about so far. Very interesting because they want to be top of the table, and anything below second will be a big failure for them given their past success. However, there are kind of quite important planks for them to fix and sort out and get some clarity over as the tournament progresses.
Yeah, mate, definitely. I should clarify, Burns, he started away at Leicester and at Bayonne, which is what I was fumbling around to nail down, but still a real kind of statement of intent. Yeah, no Robbie Henshaw as well through injury. There's someone else who propped up in my list, the Calvin Nash and Jimmy O'Brien. They're coming into this a little bit beaten up. And yeah, if they can sneak a win in Paris, phenomenal. I know we'll do a bigger preview episode, but yeah, just a really interesting tournament for Andy Farrell to try and find some answers, especially hoping to see more front row depth-wise and across other areas. Should we do Scotland? Scotland with quite a nice, easy squad actually for them. Although if you told Dave Cherry when he headed off to Van in the Pro D2 that, oh, by the way, you'll get a Scotland recall at the age of 35. I'm not entirely sure that he's buying it, but he is back in the squad. So he's back in, as is Johnny Gray, who I was watching footage of Bristol Bordeaux Bègles the other day, and I was like, oh yeah, Johnny Gray's at Bordeaux Bègles. So those are the two kind of names that are interesting in what otherwise is a fairly solid Scotland squad.
Yeah, solid, and they're kind of Hooker is an interesting one, isn't it? It's interesting you brought up Dave Cherry straight away. Gregor Hiddleston at Glasgow has been an all-action part of how well they've gone this season, and his omission was the kind of selection that was the main area kind of friction for fans looking at that squad, because otherwise it was quite settled and it spoke for itself. There are some really good players in the Scotland A squad, including Harry Patterson, Gregor Hiddleston himself, Andy Onyama Christie. So that speaks to the depth they've got in those positions. They know what they need to do. The last weekend for them is looming large against Ireland, and you always have, going into this tournament, the Six Nations, there are pinch point games that feel like must-win ones for any given side, right? Scotland probably have two, I think. I think they have home against England. That shapes their tournament, and it also shapes England's tournament, which is very interesting. But the away game at Ireland, if they go into that having performed pretty well, they can go from, I think all of the optimism, all of the pessimism that was around them in November dissipates if they win in Ireland. I think it will depend what sort of shape they get to as far as injuries to that last weekend, because, as I say, a constricted schedule could really hurt the nations with smaller playing pools. It could hurt anybody because, it can really throw off the sort of connections and the cohesion that any given squad has. Perhaps it's the sort of the smaller player pools have more vulnerable. But I don't know. I'm always higher on Scotland than I feel like Scotland fans are, because I've seen them just outwit England so often over the last kind of 5 years. Ireland will absolutely feel as though they will be able to kind of put the squeeze on Scotland up front and have kind of little to worry about and come through quite easily. So that game is almost the one that you'll want to fast forward and get to. And clearly, Scotland can't do that. They'll respect each and every opponent as they come. But yeah, it's certainly a squad that's strong in a lot of areas. 9 especially, midfield especially, potentially the sort of youngster to watch out of all the squads is Freddie Douglas. He's the Edinburgh sort of open side looks exceptional, looks so technically adept around the ball and in defence. He's just a sort of utter nuisance at the breakdown. And whether he gets opportunities, I think he's only got a single cap so far. Whether he gets more opportunities will be kind of informative as to what Townsend's thinking of his potential ahead of the next World Cup. But yeah, I don't know. Where do you? This Scotland's tournament, I think, is going to be dominated by speculation over Gregor Townsend's future, which is understandable, because there's a lot of kind of love for what Franco Smith's doing. Gregor Townsend's point was that although those Argentina and New Zealand losses sort of went away, they did, but that actually Scotland was still playing some of the best rugby that they have under him. Is that enough? Did that convince you or not?
As someone who, at the back end of my time at the Telegraph, covered quite a few Scotland games, and very happily, I love making that trip up to Murrayfield and saw them in big games against South Africa there at Murrayfield and a couple of others which have now slipped my brain. I actually found that though the Argentina and the New Zealand results incredibly damaging. And I felt that the manner of them, especially the Argentina one, the All Blacks one, I get it. There's a lot of pressure to make history, although with hindsight, given what's happened with New Zealand rugby since, that result has aged even worse. The Argentina one I just thought was unacceptable, and it doesn't help. It doesn't help Gregor Townsend and Scotland that Franco Smith is doing such a good job with Glasgow, and he really is doing a phenomenal job because you have somebody there ready and waiting, and also somebody I liked how. It must have been in the build-up to the Saracens game last week, like Smith coming out and saying, look, I really hope you're going to help me replace Hugh Jones and Adam Hastings, who are heading off at the end of the season, so that we can remain competitive. And then he still beat Saracens 28-3 or whatever it was. I feel like Gregor Townsend's in a really tricky position. What I would say is, talking about Scotland in this little section with France and Ireland is quite interesting because Scotland, by comparison, personnel-wise, look in a phenomenal position of strength, don't they? Like there's not too many key injuries. They know what they have. There's consistency in selection. There's young guys like Freddie Douglas, and Liam McConnell was the other name that came to mind, who looks really promising. But actually, how are those guys going to get into a starting back row when Scotland is so deep? Personnel isn't the issue for Scotland, it's results. Like this Ireland record, no win over Ireland since 2017, has almost become a bit of a millstone because they've spoken up, they've bigged up their respective talents going into these games against Ireland, and rightly so, and yet this kind of run continues of failing to get close. So I think as ridiculous as this might sound to Scottish supporters, winning over England, if that was to happen, isn't enough anymore. I think Scottish supporters are after more than that. They need to beat Ireland. They need to be winning 4 games out of 5 in a tournament or more. I think the pressure has gone up considerably, not just because of what Glasgow are doing, but because of the way Scotland folded in November. So they are in a bit of a tricky spot, and I'm excited to see whether they can actually deliver after 2 such damaging losses in the autumn.
Totally. Yeah. If I had 2 concerns for them, it would be tight 5 depth. I think Xander Fagerson is just such an important. I was thinking he might be the most important player to any side in this Six Nations. Is that fair to say? And then the other slight concern, and it's only a slight concern, is that Finn Russell hasn't been as sharp as he has been for Bath of late. And that might be a changeover of attack coach there with Lee Blackett leaving, Martin Gleeson coming in. It might be fatigue after at the back end of a Lions year. Or during halfway through a post Lions season, because that's a really important context to kind of add. But yeah, it's funny going from this sort of mood of going from really buoyant Glasgow under Franco Smith to sort of Scotland, where I do feel like I do agree with Townsend that they're playing some really excellent rugby in that, but the sort of mood music is more somber than that because of the results. Yeah, I just love the Six Nations is so good because of the neuroses that fly around each team, and I think everybody sort of certainly can speak for the sort of British and Irish teams. I think the God, we don't want to be favourites, and it's every year. Oh, don't talk us up too much. But this year, you really the kind of caveats with every team are quite obvious, I think, and yeah, that just makes it more unpredictable and a lot more fun.
It really, really does. Charlie, we've ticked off 3 squads there. Let's have a little tiny break, and then we're going to talk about Wales, but I don't think it's going to be entirely squad related. So yeah. Charlie, Wales have to, I was going to say, have to take the field and play in the Six Nations soon. But I mean, who knows? I mean, there could be strike action. We've come close to Wales player strikes in the past, haven't we? I mean, the way things are building up towards their opener against England, if we think about everything that's happened this week with the select committee and the news about the Ospreys. It is pure turmoil again, isn't it, for Wales?
Yeah, it's bleak. I was earlier this season, before the start of the season, I think. I was at the Scarlets visiting them, and there was still an acceptance that it was bleak, but there was still a sort of trace of, look, we're used to this sort of adversity, and I think it's maybe building up to a point that is beyond what is actually so. It will be so claustrophobic for those players, certainly at the Ospreys, at Cardiff as well. It reminds me quite a lot of, and we neither of us have been as close to the Wales stuff, but it reminded me of sort of covering the Worcester collapse, the Wasps collapse, the London Irish collapse, where you're talking to players who are fearing for their livelihood, and there is obviously then there's a desire for them to stick together because they've got to play games together, but there's also, your head is racing. You know, if you've got mortgages to pay, if you've got young families, it's absolutely horrible. And it was interesting that Josh McNally, who's at Cardiff now, came out and is at Cardiff now, but was at London Irish when they went under, and has subsequently joined Bath and then went to Cardiff. And I've interviewed Josh McNally before, and he's just a very sound man, but he sort of said, look, I'd just like to extend my sympathy to the Osprey squad, because that uncertainty is absolutely horrible. And it's an unenviable task for Steve Tandy to essentially have representatives from those regions who have been in turmoil for these months and have to sort of galvanize them. And I know that the strike action, the potential for strike action was 3 years ago, if I got that right. And
yeah.
I know that there are lingering regrets that there wasn't something more robust that happened from that. So I don't know. Maybe that's the solution to, but that would be, it would be devastating. But I think the whole tournament would throw the whole tournament into turmoil. But they've reached a drastic point in it all, and the players, seemingly from what we're hearing, the players have been left in the dark. The Ospreys management don't seem aligned with the Ospreys ownership, and therefore the Ospreys management are also in the dark and also have their hands tied. So it's just a horrible situation all round. And yeah, they are going to make up kind of, Dan Edwards has been Wales' gun fly half, right? They seem to be sort of wanting to put their faith in him for the rest of this World Cup cycle, and that's just one example. It's the sort of discussing the ins and outs of the squad. Almost feel it would be really nice if that was the main talking point, but it's nowhere near. It's it's an existential thing now, and that's just really sad.
Yeah. You had Ospreys players walking out of a meeting on Wednesday with bosses from the region. You had the WIU top brass facing a select committee on Wednesday as well, which I understand, having read about it a bit from here, was a long-winded grilling, to say the least. We've spoken about this before. I think it comes back to just how this whole process has been communicated and managed. I think that's the big issue here. That's what has caused so much frustration. That's why there is so much angst. The process in itself is always going to be horrendous, because you're talking about hundreds of jobs of livelihoods going, but there is probably a better way for it to play out than this. And the latest kind of developments this week just feel like an extension of what we were talking about last year. And I think that kind of beggars belief slightly, because you're right. I was looking at a predicted Wales team up on Wales Online earlier, and I was thinking all of this just feels totally like irrelevant. I don't really have too much of a thought of whether it's going to be Nicky Smith or Reece Carey at loose prop, or what they're going to do with Lewis Rees-Zammit, whether he's going to be a winger or a fullback. It's incredibly tricky for the Wales management. And I spoke to Steve Tandy recently for a feature coming out in Rugby World in the next edition, and I couldn't have been more impressed actually with his passion and enthusiasm and his awareness of the situation in terms of the challenge of rebuilding Wales, but also how proud he is to be doing the role. Yeah, I mean, if the other nations think they've got problems, then not on this scale, not on what Wales are going through. It's desperate. And I struggle to see how, even with the best will in the world, they'll be able to go to Twickenham for that opening game and be able to have their heads level because there's just so much going on in the background.
Yeah, start with England away, and they have France at home, Scotland at home, Ireland away. And then before the sort of game that I don't think it's unfair to say is their sort of defining one, at home against Italy, could be I don't know. I don't think the thing is it's apathy for a lot of fans you want to engage, and then for the ones you do want to engage, anger levels are through the roof. So yeah, it's tricky, and it's the timing of all of this stuff, isn't it? It's how there has to be a statement by the WRU on the ownership, and we hear through reports mainly by Wales Online, who are doing a phenomenal job, the guys there. This ownership model is looking more and more like Ospreys are not going to be an entity. And then the next day you have the Six Nations squad announcement. It's calamitous. You're right. It's really if there are seeds of optimism or seeds of even distraction, then they're just quashed straight away, and it's bleak. It's just bleak hit after hit after hit. And they're coming into a tournament off the back of that. Don't have Jack Morgan, who honestly I covered the first autumn game against Argentina, and it was like he put that side that side on his back, and they ended up being defeated quite heavily after Argentina pulled away at the end. But that was the sort of performance individually and actually collectively. There were some kind of encouraging bits of kind of phase shape and more encouraging stuff like that, but that then dissipated very quickly, and it's hard really to know what else to say, but it's just the predictability with which that they are beginning a tournament with these gaffes going on is just brutal.
Anyway, cut to mid-Feb and they'll to mid-February and they'll have beaten France, and we'll be like, look at Wales. No, I think you're right. I was just skimming through the select committee notes because I didn't want to make sure I'd missed anything. Staggering that it took an hour for the subject of the Ospreys to even come up. Listen, as fans, we feel for you. I appreciate you're properly, Ospreys fans in particular, I appreciate that you're probably in, if you don't laugh, you'll cry territory. Yeah, it's pretty desperate. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else about the actual squad and side that we should mention before we move on.
No, so no Tommy Rafal, which I guess is interesting that way, even in the absence of Morgan. Gabe Hamer-Webb getting a call up on the wing, went really well for Cardiff before he went to Leicester, has had fewer opportunities at Leicester, perhaps understandable with how Radwan and Hassel Collins are going, but really committed, really explosive, threw his weight around in the Stormers game recently. Probably an important point to make with regard to sort of the prospects of a strike is that the Wales players via their Rugby Players Association have given the bosses of the union a deadline of 6th of February to provide any clarity on what will happen this season. And that's obviously a day prior to England-Wales. So you can predict that, right? Can't you? It's going to go down feels like it's going to go down to the wire either way, as it did 3 years ago. And then the players sort of ended up kind of making choice to play. Yeah, I don't know. We did that. Their build-up is just unavoidably going to be shrouded by what happens there with players really anxious about their futures. That's such a slippery, it's not even slippery, it's such a sort of unstable foundation for Steve Tandy to have to prepare a squad for Six Nations, for Steve Tandy to prepare the squad for the Six Nations.
Yeah, I mean, listen, they will have the backing of every neutral in every game, I imagine. Let's have another quick pause, Charlie, and then let's finish off with a bit of chat about Razor and the All Blacks, because we haven't spoken about that yet. And just a few thoughts on England's squad as well, ahead of them naming that on Friday. Charlie, before we chat Razor, I realised that we hadn't mentioned Italy, who named their squad yesterday. Actually, quite a few concerning injuries, headlined by Noange Capuozzo, followed by, he's expected to be out for, I think, 3 weeks. So he will be back in the tournament, but he's not there initially. And then you've also got no Sebastian Negri, no Ross Vintcent, no Tommaso Allan, who's their key goal kicker, really. And Gianmarco Lucchese's out as well. So a few kind of injuries to be worried about there. And I know that you're a bit sad that someone that you spoke to last year isn't in the squad either.
Yes, no place for Enoch Opoku Gyamfi, but he was capped in the game against Chile last year. So they've kind of captured him, and I imagine his development will continue at Bath for a little while. I think he's contracted there till the end of next season. But another guy that's, well, a few guys that are going really well in the Premiership, both Zambanin and the lock, and at scrum half Stephen Varney, Exeter going brilliantly, have really hit the ground running at Sandy Park and have been a really big part of that resurgence for the Chiefs. And then Eduardo Todaro. So I think I'm right in saying he was capped in the same game as Apoko Gyamfi, and he's just lighting it up for Saints. Quite slight, not hugely physically imposing, but deceptively strong, really well balanced, really elusive. And in the absence of Capuozzo, he will be fighting for game time in the Six Nations, which is a huge compliment, but absolutely a vindication of what a talent he is.
Yeah, that's why they've gone with Matt Gallagher coming back. There's some nice options across the board, really. I would like to see Todaro getting a start would be awesome. They've recalled Matt Gallagher, the former Bath fullback, so he could be an option there. Pazziarella or Varney as scrum half is a nice kind of position for Quesada to be in. Yeah, look, plenty of options. I feel fairly good about Italy. Maybe less so if Garbisi goes down at fly half and how they would handle that. I think, I think after where the autumn went, beaten Australia, I think they're in a good spot, really.
Hard schedule.
Scotland, not a nice schedule.
At home. Scotland at home first is their marker game, one that we'd say they'd want to. If they win that, it's a sunny kind of championship, almost regardless. But then Ireland and France away is not easy, and then England at home they have after the bye. Yeah, it's not easy, and then they finish with that trip to Wales. Could cap a really kind of optimistic championship, or be a bit of a dogfight for them to get a little bit of impetus back. Yeah, I'm excited to see how they go too.
If they're going to Wales at the end, does that mean we're now 4 years removed from the crazy late drama in Garbisi in tears on the pitch? Yeah, we must be, because they won in Wales 2 years ago, didn't they? And that was kind of that was almost like death knell of Welsh rugby, because it had happened twice. Which death knell, I hear you say at home. But then, 2022 must have been the kind of dramatic late Capuozzo setting up the winner in Garbisi, and wow, what is time? That is terrifying. Razor, then. I mean, I'll be interested to see what you think about this. So I went to a media session for the All Blacks before the England game at the Lensbury. And maybe this is like my brain playing tricks on me looking back on it. But I did find it was quite a weird setup and a weird vibe around just that kind of brief media event. It was very different to kind of different All Blacks presses I'd experienced under Hansen and Henry and Foster. And at the time, I think I just put that down to it was just a different vibe under Razor. And that was why things went that way. And I was like, okay. But actually, in hindsight, I look back on it and I think that was quite strange. And yeah, the fact that he's gone weirdly doesn't feel like a massive surprise, because the All Blacks seem to keep repeating the same mistakes, didn't they? They kept having these second half collapses. They kept kind of losing focus. Actually, when you reflect on, because we were so focused on what a big day it was for England, if you think about the manner of how the All Blacks played in that game, real alarm bells. And so the fact that it was still a massive surprise that it happened when it's happened. But yeah, how are you feeling about it?
The difference in vibes, understandable, isn't it? Because if you think about those, Graham Henry, Steve Hansen, Ian Foster, they are all literally ex-school teachers and policemen, right? So they're gonna have a certain management style, and Scott Robertson kind of is a far kind of more expressive presence. One thing we heard sort of before he started was that it was going to be interesting how he'd handle the detail and drill down into the detail that you kind of need to have as a test match coach. And you're right. There were recurring faults which suggested that technical things weren't being addressed well enough. So high ball stuff. Argentina just led the chase really well, and that was the kind of foundation for a win in Buenos Aires. The collapses were really odd. The extent to which, and I know that New Zealand lost really heavily at Twickenham in the Qatar Airways Cup on the verge of the last World Cup, but then that loss in Wellington at home, just the extent to it. And I remember you doing a piece at the time where you're like, these are big errors and these are damaging errors. And, that reflected something sort of seriously off as a collective, whether messages weren't going in, whether messages weren't even being relayed, whether, if there were fissures in the team even. And David Kirk, who's I don't know what his job title is quite at the is he president?
I think he's chair. President. I think president of New Zealand. I think he's the chair. And thank God I know the point you're getting to. Thank God someone's there, because there's no chief exec and there's also no high performance chief, is there?
No, but so his sort of, it was definitely not a revolt. Wasn't convincing. And it was Jamie Wall's footage that I've seen, but that wasn't convincing at all. That looked like, is he protesting a bit too much there? It certainly seems as though the players, certainly a big contingent of the players, weren't pleased. They weren't pleased with either the standard or the kind of methods of the coaching. There seemed to sort of, we were hearing sort of reports of sort of major splits, and if somebody like Ardie Surveyor, as Liam Napier, our friend, kind of reported, which set all this in motion, and then Rory O'Connor got the phenomenal scoop of it of Scott Robertson actually leaving. Liam's initial piece had been like, look, that could be it for Ardie Surveyor's Test career, and you're like, wow, that's a guy that he's not ready to retire, and it's something seriously wrong with the environment that is causing that. So I don't know. I don't know. There are plenty of All Blacks fans who feel as though this kind of move can kickstart them and make them into a force again. But it's drastic for someone to walk away after what is such a, I've seen it very well described as, it isn't just the win percentage, it's the manner of the losses. And there's something in that, because do you know what? Both covered that England-New Zealand game. And I think it was for their Tom Roebuck try that sort of put a bit of daylight, gave England a bit of daylight at the end. Their phase shape just wasn't going anywhere. It was being eaten up by a sort of really mobile, more energetic England defence, and Henry Pollock pressurised a pullback that didn't go to hand, and Will Jordan just slumped. And I remember thinking, that is really unusual. That looks like you don't see that from any nation, really. The game was still in the balance, and it looked like a little bit of surrender. And I just can't, how fallible that looked. Things like that don't happen in setups where everybody's pulling in the same direction. So in retrospect now, you're thinking, okay, yeah, something wasn't right there. And then with what Liam reported, clearly, the review must have been brutal for somebody to go. But then the writing on the wall with, Leon McDonald going. I'm really sorry, I forget the name of the coach that is.
Jason Holland, I think, was the other one who said he was going to go before the tour started.
Before that tour, yeah, it's whether it's the people that have made that decision or have come to that decision, they're going to have to be accountable if it continues to slide. Because to me, and I know, sorry to go back to what I was saying about, there are supporters who are saying that, this is the best thing that could happen to the All Blacks ahead of the next World Cup. But if it continues to slide, it also feels like there's a lot to address, and it's going to take a strong character to address them and because there can be big divides in the squad, but you're still going to have without a mass clear out, you're still going to have to kind of rely on players that have previously not got on, I think. So it's difficult. It's very difficult.
Yeah. So Liam and Gregor Paul as well had some brilliant reporting on just how it all played out. This kind of idea of Razor as kind of like the culture coach, essentially, not actually doing that much hands-on coaching, and that being left to Scott Hansen is fascinating. Maybe this was in Jamie Wall's stuff, but the idea of the All Blacks players basically at half-time in games looking for tactics, looking for like second half adjustments, and instead getting sold on like bigger picture ideas also fascinates me. Just the one thing that I'm a bit mystified by as we record this on Thursday is that I'm slightly surprised that they didn't have the replacement kind of lined up and ready to go, because I kind of admire the move to get rid of Robertson if it's clearly not working, and it's clearly not working. I think the lack of having somebody in place and a name ready to go, that looks a bit shoddy. And I guess it's not a surprise if there's no chief exec and it's just David Kirk in like an empty HQ with the board. But I think it would have looked a lot smoother if they'd said, right, Rose is gone, and one day later they've been like, this is the successor. It's Jamie Joseph or it's Joe Schmidt or whoever. And I think that kind of the gap between the announcements concerns me a little bit, because this is meant to be one of the finest sporting institutions in the world, right? Who have admittedly got it wrong with their coach selection. They were worried. A lot of the board members were worried before appointing Robertson about his lack of test experience. He was one of the very few. He was the first kind of coach for a while who Henry and Hansen had been to Wales. Foster had been an assistant, had test experience. They all had worldly experience, as you noted earlier. Like Foster was as a businessman, the other two as teachers. Robertson is just pure rugby. So they want to learn from those mistakes. I just find the lack of, like, the fact that Jamie Joseph isn't already installed, I find that a bit weird and a bit odd. But yeah, maybe that's just me, and my kind of personal kind of preferences. But yeah, I would have wanted to see somebody in place.
No, what we've kind of done on this pod, I think, is kind of set the scene for, and you don't want to be talking in World Cup cycles all the time. But now that we've had the draw and, there are big moves happening sort of around the world, and we've got this fascinating Six Nations to look forward to, it's really interesting just how much something can change in a World Cup cycle, right? And so to finish off, England are announcing their squad tomorrow as we record, on the back of 11 test wins. You keep having to say test wins, don't you? Because of that loss against France, which we mentioned earlier. But 11 test wins sounds very good. They are kind of, again, like in a like probably Scotland, in a reassuringly dull place with this. It's tinkering and it's small things like who's going to be third tight head. There's tight head crisis, but really Joe Hayes is now seemingly is perfectly capable of starting test matches. Trevor Davison is still going really well for Saints. Billy Seller is this young guy that they are really excited by, sort of more excited by than guys like Asher Apokifjaw, who's injured. Third loosehead, probably an interesting spot. Whether they go for a fourth lock or they trust Chandler Cunningham South. 15 is interesting as well, with Furbank not having much game time and Daly in sort of fit form. And then the rest of it is kind of either or, really. Well, the rest of it really is a centre partnership. Who do they go for? They do have those options, and how they configure a bench probably are the sort of big things. Where are your eyes going to be drawn to tomorrow?
I was going to say on the props, on the prop injuries, if you're a head coach, you would never wish to be tested necessarily in a position like that. But actually, kind of a great opportunity for Borthwick, if he wants to get a look at Billy Seller or Afo Sogbon as an option over the course of the next few weeks, and you can get an idea of what they're like. It would be in a bench role behind Hayes, but actually not necessarily the worst thing in the world. You would rather Paul Stewart hadn't done his Achilles, but we are where we are. So that's interesting. I think it's, God, I mean, if I had £1 for every time we've spoken about England's midfield, I'd be flying first class back home next week, instead of at the back. No, but I genuinely, Max Ajomo fascinates me, because after the Argentina game, I was like, wow, that's awesome. Like, he's had this really cool test against Argentina, probably not going to be starting in the Six Nations against Wales. And you're like, I don't know. Depends what they want.
I'm coming around to that. I think, and I think he said himself at the end of the Argentina game, he said that, Steve Borthwick's been on to me about off-ball running. And when you do watch him, I don't think I gave his sort of athleticism, mobility, enough credit, really, because he's so much poise on the ball, so much swagger about how he distributes, at the reception at the line. But in games like the Cash game away, for example, he had to carry in some pretty tight spaces and did really well. And defensively, I think he can be, a really solid piece for England. Seb Atkinson, injured at a really tough time because he was exceptional, I thought, in Argentina, and then just has been part of a struggling Gloucester team, hasn't he? And then this injury, what was it? Is it knee and ankle and hip? Basically sounded like a whole side. He's messed up his whole side of one limb, poor guy. But hasn't, understandably, clearly feeling his way back after that. Fraser Dingwall got knocked out quite badly. I thought actually potentially quite awkwardly, Steve Borthwick, him and Freeman didn't go brilliantly together against the Scarlets as a 12-13. I am really keen to see Freeman at 13. I don't think that'll be with Lawrence at 12 though.
No, I would agree. I would say on Freeman at 13. I don't know why I didn't feel this way in the autumn and why I was fine with them chopping and changing, but I feel like they need to stick with it for 5 tests or 4 tests and give it a real chance. I don't think it's fair on Freeman to ask him to play 13 one week when he's still adapting to it and learning how to do it, and then shift him out to the wing next week. I think you're only going to benefit. You're only going to see the long-term benefits of him in that role, and I think there are loads if you give him time to adapt to it and let him kind of absorb it. Yeah, and you're right. I don't think Freeman and Lawrence works best, which actually, yeah, suddenly Ajoma, you're like, okay, fantastic. I mean, the timing of his passing against Edinburgh, he moves the ball so late and so perfectly that I know that Edinburgh weren't up to much at Bath, but defences just hate it. Like, it's so hard to play against. And he is sneaky robust as well. Yeah, that's probably the area I'm most intrigued by. Any final thoughts on the squad before we round off this monster of an episode?
No, I think having spoken about I think if England are in a good spot going into a tournament where that game against France, they will want to have at least a chance of winning the title, if not going there with 4 from 4, looking to repeat the 2016 Slam. I touched on sort of this race not to be favourites. England have got to puff their chests out, I think, a bit. They've developed their depth. They've got impetus. They've got stability in their coaching, and their coaching team looks quite balanced for the first time in a little bit, maybe. And yeah, I think they're in a good spot. I'm really intrigued to see how they go when they're all together. Murrayfield, they won't take their eye off the ball because it's a home game and they mean a lot to them, and they'll want to get off to a convincing start. But Murrayfield is looming large. That's the game. That's the game that they have to get right. Having just really found Scotland very difficult to deal with over the last few years.
Hey! Save all this for the predictions episode. Whenever that drops, when we're back in the same country, at least. Thanks, Charlie. What a pleasure. I feel like we've covered a lot there. I won't tell you my afternoon plans, but I hope you're not too cold. And yeah,
you're very kind. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. My pleasure. Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated. We will chat to you next week. Bye-bye.